Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us online for tonight's book launch and conversation with Te-Ping Chen and Charles Yu. My name is Lily Philpott. I'm the Programs Manager at AAWW, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. Please let us know in the chat where you are watching from. For those of you who are new to the Asian American Writers Workshop, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian diasporic literature and storytelling. At a time when these communities are specifically vulnerable, we continue to offer a space in which we can imagine a more just future. You can visit aaww.org or follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where the recording of this event will be posted. During the event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and/or misogynist will be flagged, and the person will be removed from this event. We will have time for audience Q&A at the end of the hour. You can ask your questions via the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Books are for sale thanks to our friends at Books Are Magic. You can find a link to purchase in the chat, and you can support our writers and an independent bookstore in doing so. We also partnered with our friends at Tables of Contents to celebrate this book launch. They worked with Chef Winston Chu to create an incredible noodle recipe inspired by Te-Ping's short stories, and you can find that recipe in the chat as well. We hope you will cook along with us. I'm going to briefly introduce Te-Ping and Charles, and then I hope you will join me in welcoming them on screen. Te-Ping Chen's fiction has been published in or is forthcoming from The New Yorker, Granta, Guernica, Tin House, and The Atlantic. A reporter with the Wall Street Journal, she was previously a correspondent for the paper in Beijing and Hong Kong. Prior to joining the journal in 2012, she spent a year in China as a Fulbright Fellow. Land of Big Numbers is her debut short story collection and is out today. Charles Yu is the author of 4 books. His latest novel, Interior Chinatown, won the 2020 National Book Award for Fiction. He's also written for shows on HBO, FX, AMC, and Adult Swim. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in a number of publications, including The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Wired, Time, and Plowshares. Please join me in welcoming Te-Ping, and thank you all for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's so exciting to see the book out in the world and just to be here with childhood friends and teachers and family and people who have opened their hearts to this book. It means the world. And it's been so exciting to see the reviews and all the feedback from readers. And when I was writing this book in Beijing, it just felt at times crazy to be obsessing about this project that really just kind of had a life inside my own head and perhaps might never have one outside of it, but the people in this room have made it possible. And so thank you so much to Naomi Gibbs, Rehani Sanders, Taryn Roeder, Jenny Xu, Michael Takins, Michael Dudding, just so many people have been a part of this launch. So grateful. Also, my parents are in this chat, so everyone say hi. They're the ones that the book is dedicated to. And I'm also really excited about Noodles. Tables of Contents has put together, in conjunction with Little Tong Noodle Shop, an amazing recipe inspired by the book, which if the link is not already in the chat, I think it'll be dropped soon. Yeah, thank you for being here. And I'm going to start by reading a little bit from the book's closing story, which is called Gubeiko's Spirit. And it's a story set in the future. For those of us in the room who know Beijing, you'll recognize Gubeiko as a part of the outskirts of Beijing, where you can still climb parts of the unrestored Great Wall far out in the periphery. The story set in future Beijing, where the subway system has been expanded to reach all the way out there. Okay, here we go. Pan entered Gubeiko Station at top speed, hurtling through the crowds, hand on her purse. It was late and her father would be getting restless, prone to wandering. She needed to get home, get on the train. At the end of the line, a guard lazily waved his security wand over her duffel coat, both sides, slowing her down. "I'm in a hurry," she said plaintively. Down the steps then, quick stepping on the too shallow stairs, dodging the march of people headed in the opposite direction, determinedly clutching their bags as they went. "Let me through," she cried. But it was 5 p.m. and Gubeiko was crowded. A train had just arrived, disgorging more people now headed to the exits. She was beaten back against the wall by the crowds. By the time she reached the foot of the stairs, the train doors had closed. It had left the station. That was all right, Pan thought. She'd get the next one. She made her way to a bench, sat down. Haste didn't pay, she reminded herself. Today she'd miscounted the change at the register and ended up 20 yuan short. She'd had to make up the difference. At home as a child, her family had nicknamed her Ranhona because she was always asking, and then, from the time she was young. I got some leeks today, her mother might say. And then I'll make some soup. And then we'll eat it. And then you'll go to sleep and stop asking questions, baby. The station filled with people. A middle-aged woman with a perm sat down beside her and fiddled with the clasp on her purse. Opposite them was a yellow ad featuring a grinning Jack Russell Terrier jumping in the air to catch what looked like the world, a globe. It was too large. Pan doubted the dog would be able to catch it. It would just bounce harmlessly off his nose. Another 10 minutes passed. Then an announcement. The next train will be delayed. We thank you for your understanding. The train was a marvel, just 2 years old, state of the art. It had doors that swung open like a singing mouth, emitting a merry chime, and closed after 20 seconds with precision. There were 26 lines already built, with another 10 underway. No other city in the world had built its subway station so quickly. Half an hour passed. The crowd swelled and milled around unhappily, everyone bundled in their coats. Pan was glad she had her seat. Every 10 minutes or so, the announcer would return. The next train will be delayed. We thank you for your understanding. A pair of teenage boys took off their coats and laid them on the ground and sat atop them. A handful of others followed suit, and then others. Pan's legs were starting to fall asleep, and she twitched her chilly toes inside of her pink boots. It had been a while since anyone else had entered the station, she noticed. They must be turning people away. Down the platform, a man in a bright blue coat was the first to try leaving. Indignant, he led a group of half a dozen commuters back up the stairs, where they banged on the access gates, which consisted of tall, solid plates of hammered metal. One guard must have taken out a stepladder, because suddenly his whole face and part of his torso appeared, peering out over the barriers. We'll get the train moving soon, he said kindly. When shouts rang out, he nodded sympathetically. I know, he said. You're tired. I'm tired too. You want to go home and eat a nice meal, rest for a while. I do too. Please be patient. We'll get there together. Then he did a little shimmy of his hips, at which the crowd laughed. After the subway system had been opened, the government had hired teams of beautiful young women to dress in tight sheathed skirts and blouses with red sashes across their chests that read, "Train goddesses serve the people." During rush hour, they stood on the platform and twitched their hips as they sang the same song. Thank you for your cooperation. Please line up, do not push. Be a civilized passenger for your safety and that of those around you. We'll get there together. Pan didn't laugh. Her father was waiting at home, waiting for her to come back and cook dinner. By now, he would be pacing anxiously in the living room, where she had left the television on all afternoon in an effort to amuse him. But his favorite program had ended an hour ago, and who knew what he might decide to do next? Light the stove? Bang his head repeatedly against a wall? She took her subway card and waved it over the gates, which flashed a red X. Let us go, she shouted, but the guard's head had already disappeared. That night, they slept on coats at careful distances from one another, on islands of spread out newspapers, heads pillowed on bags. The lights never went out. A baby made small keening noises through the night, but did not cry. They were too far down to get any signal, but Pan, who seized a patch of ground near the bathrooms at the west end of the tunnel, kept an eye on her phone anyway, watching the time, 11:10, 4:30, 6:32. Her stomach clenched anxiously any time she thought of her father. Perhaps one of the neighbors would have stopped to check on him, she thought to herself. It had happened before. At 8 a.m., 2 guards appeared, this time through a side door marked staff only that had been locked overnight. The first came wheeling a cart stacked with boxes of ramen and tall thermoses filled with hot water. Each person got a cup, a toothbrush, and a sliver of soap, which came in pouches that bore the stamped white letters, humanitarian supplies. Repairs still underway, he said shortly. A man dressed in an untidy reflective smock, the kind that street cleaners wore, got up, brushing himself off. You can't treat us like this, he shouted. We have things to do. Let us go. The first guard shook his head regretfully. Passengers must exit at a different station from where they entered, he said. It's in the rule book. The second guard taped a sheet of paper on the wall. Owing to mechanical breakdown, it ran in printed letters, trains at Gubeko Station will be delayed. We assure passengers that they will get to their destinations. Thank you for your cooperation. A red seal was affixed in one corner. Let us out with you, another man said, pointing at the door through which the guards had entered. A third guard was wheeling in another cart. Can't do that, the first guard said. He tapped the staff only sign and began to lay out trays of plastic utensils, washcloths, and napkins. Other passengers gathered, peppering the man with questions. How much longer? What was the problem exactly? Could their fares be refunded? We'll get you to your destination, is all they would reply. They would take messages to loved ones, they said. They would ensure work units were notified. So for those who've read the book, you know how things unfold from here. It's an unexpected ride, like much of the book is. Thank you so much to the Asian American Writers Workshop for hosting this event, and to Houghton Mifflin Harcourt for publishing my funny little book. And thank you so much to Charlie Yu for being here and being part of this launch.
Hi, Te-Ping. Nice to meet you.
Hi.
Sort of. We've met a little bit. That was a great reading. I'm excited to be here and talk to you about your wonderful collection. Hi, everyone. And thanks for that wonderful introduction, Lily. Thanks to the Asian American Writers Workshop as well. I have to say, first off, you have a great singing voice.
That tune was made up right there. So yeah, I'm sorry. It was a little.
Really?
Yeah.
All the more so. You just like sort of improvise that?
I spend a lot of time singing to my son these days, so it came readily.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I was like, I didn't realize this song had a tune. Very impressive.
I didn't either, and then it did.
Well, I mean, assuming you're going on a tour and you're going to have to read that portion, are you going to always do the same tune? Because someone's going to have to.
I would have to rewind and watch this recording and try and learn
it. Yeah, some Te-Ping Chen completist is like, she did it different. I don't know what the song is. Especially Gubeko Station, I feel like especially resonant now. People all trapped waiting for things to get fixed. I don't know if obviously you wrote it in a different time, but just at the moment, I can certainly empathize with being wondering how much longer, among other things. Speaking of which, how you're launching your book today is the publication date. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes.
How do you feel?
It's exciting. I also feel like it's so wonderful to see the response that the book is getting, but since it's all just happening purely through my laptop screen, it also feels entirely possible that this is just a figment of my imagination or some strange projection of my psyche, and none of this is real. It's all been really strange. And one of the things that is most strange and exciting is having you again be here. I just wanted to say how much I appreciate your work. And I just remember the first time that I read How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional World, just almost holding my breath as I was reading it, thinking, oh my God, like how is he managing to pull this off, this incredibly audacious thing, which, you know, it's a book that, of course, is and like an incredible idea, right? But not just an idea for idea's sake, not just gimmicky or anything like that. It has this incredible emotional core. It's really emotionally resonant, and that's what I love so much about your work. And yeah, when I learned that you wanted to be part of this event and that you read and liked Land of Big Numbers, it just meant so much to me. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. And I feel like you asked me a question, but now I have forgotten that question. I'm sorry.
No, you answered it, and I appreciate your kind words and your attempt at deflecting attention from yourself. But let's, I'm going to reroute back to you and your book. This is the beginning of, I assume, a virtual book tour. How's it been launching, a book in the pandemic?
It's been good. Yeah, it's everything's so strange right now. I do feel like as you noted with Gubeko Spirit, there are some stories that have proved surprisingly, I think, resonant in this moment, more so than I expected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to ask a little bit about, sort of your origin story as a writer, as people have maybe read already in interviews with you, or in your bio, I think you're a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
How can you talk a little bit about how first, sort of how you've came to writing fiction, and then how you've been balancing that with what I assume is a very demanding job.
Yeah. So I came to writing fiction. I'd always sort of written fiction and poetry growing up. And it was something that as a kid I loved to do, but never thought I could do it, that it was like something you could do professionally. And so I became a journalist, and it's a job that I love. It's just something that enables me to exercise my curiosity about other people in a really compulsive way, and also get to write. And it kind of felt miraculous that this job existed at all, especially to get to be a reporter for the Journal in China, which felt like a really rare privilege, and especially so now, given the circumstances when so many journalists have been kicked out of the country. As far as this book goes, when I started to think about Land of Big Nerves, well, to rewind a bit, I guess, at the time, just before I began to write these stories, I was working on a book of historical fiction, and it was something that I had been wrestling with for a while, set in pre-communist China. And I'd been picking it up after a number of years. It was sort of an older project, and just had lost steam, fallen out of love with the project. And I remember one night when I was biking home from the bureau in Beijing, just having this phrase, Shanghai Murmur, pop into my head, and thinking that I would try and write a short story around it. And in part, it was also feeling like I had been writing historical fiction, and and why am I world building at a time when there's just whole worlds around me that I know really intimately. And it turns out it is much easier to write when you have the material readily at hand, and you're not trying diligently to research, what kind of alcohol was most popular in Shanghai 1930s. Yeah, and material not only at hand, but also just I felt like material that was like readily chomping at the bit, and all lined up and saying like, pick me. And that's really what sort of the experience felt like once I actually sat down to write. Was just, I had spent so much time living in the country, traveling, and just assembling all these notes and details and characters and images that once I sat down and started to write these stories, became really readily. Yeah, but I mean, that said, it was definitely a process and a learning process of throwing things at the wall and seeing what would stick. I started and threw away stories inspired by a Tibetan sky burial, inspired by one trip I took to Western China, one about an older gentleman living in a house that was haunted by these ghosts. They weren't scary, they just kind of hung around as like these unwelcome house guests. I wrote and threw away a whole story called the China Syndrome, which was about this highly contagious, disfiguring skin condition that starts in China and sweeps the globe and totally remakes the economy. Which is, I looked at it the other day, and it's funny to revisit because there are some parallels with the current moment. But yeah, I felt like I had so many ideas and so much material, and it was just a matter of trying to pick the best and wrangle and shepherd the unruly and try and fit it all into 10 stories.
Yeah, let's dive into some of those stories. The book just came out, so I guess, maybe there are people that bought it and read it already, but if you haven't, but there have been many ways people could have read your work. Speaking of which, Lulu, right? Lulu was published in The New Yorker, which was that right? The New Yorker.
That's right.
A couple of years ago. And in this story, Lulu and her big brother. Does Big Brother ever get a name?
He does not have a name.
Okay. He's a minute older. Is that right? And then Lulu.
Mhm.
So they're twins. And there's an exchange in the story, if you don't mind, if I could just read it briefly.
Sure.
I had no idea these kinds of things went on, she added soberly. We were lucky. We weren't rich. Dad worked for the government. We were comfortable. Of course we were, I told her, but so were lots of people. And it didn't mean that she had to expose herself to trouble. Um, that's Lulu and her big brother talking to each other. In an interview with the New Yorker, you said there's a certain duality of life in China and in most places in which you have very different realities that coexist. I thought that was interesting to think about in terms of reading the story and then reading this comment that you made about it. Can you talk a little bit about the duality or different realities that that are coexisting in China and how that might compare with dualities here, maybe?
Sure. Yeah, so for people who haven't read the story, it traces a pair of twins, one who becomes a professional video gamer, the brother who narrates the story, and his sister, who becomes kind of this online dissident and activist. She started out as a really promising student, but takes this much more dangerous, divergent path. And that duality that you're talking about, yeah, is very much encapsulating these two characters. And when I was thinking about that duality and in terms of how it relates to the States, I think China, of course, is an authoritarian country with a very different economic and political system, and it's very different from the United States, but it's also a place where, like the US, you can have very different realities pressed up against each other in China. So it might be high rises and Gucci stores, and less than a mile away, people sleeping under underpasses, and protesters from the provinces being bundled away into police vans, and a feeling of this incredibly rich and varied consumer culture, full of freedom of choice, but at the same time also deep poverty and dissidents getting locked up. And there are aspects of that duality which reminded me of some of the cognitive dissonance that does come with living in the US, which is of course a really deeply unequal society, one that has increasingly become more so. And the conversation too, I think, in the last year around Black Lives Matter is one as well that has been on my mind, just thinking about the ways that certain realities, right, can be invisible to others, even when people are neighbors living in the same street, or same society. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it absolutely does. It gets me thinking too. And I think I implied in the question, maybe I was trying to force a parallel where there isn't one, or trying to put a US-centric kind of worldview on something that maybe there isn't, because one thing that really struck me while reading her collection was how destabilizing in a good way it is for me, for how unfamiliar it was, the realities that you were describing, in terms of what realities are, what life is like in China. And so maybe it isn't possible for us to fully imagine. Maybe that's why you had to write fiction about it, to put us in the shoes of people living there.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear you say that, because I do think there's an element of just living in the US in particular, where we tend to see China as a monolith where we project our own ideas onto it, or it's a headline, it's something that we flick past and sort of feel like we have a glancing knowledge of, and we think of GDP and statistics, and we lose sight of the human. And there's a lot that's absurd and cruel in Chinese society, but there's also so much more, and so many more individual stories that are, about people who are making lives in the cracks of the system, and people who are just endlessly inventive and creative and full of fire and pragmatism. And I wanted very much to also evoke those sorts of stories, which I think when people think of China, they're not the ones, it's not the view of China that is perhaps easiest to access from a distance.
Lulu in the story is writing blog posts with some very evocative titles: The Mother Popsicle, The Frustrated Sleeper. And those titles don't I don't know if you want to spoil sort of what's happening at all, but I did want to ask, do you get seeds of ideas based on real reports you're hearing? And I mean, these are some sort of incredible things that are happening that Lulu's trying to write about.
Yeah, the collection, there's a lot in the collection that is, of course, there's magical realism, there's the surreal in it, and there are also details that are absolutely drawn from my time in China. Those two that you bring up, one, The Frustrated Sleeper, that was about an elderly woman who dies after her her home has been demolished basically while she's sleeping, and she dies amid the rubble. And in another case, that was one that was absolutely drawn from a headline I remember reading. And then the other one, The Mother Popsicle, that was one that came from a conversation I had with a woman who worked with a human rights lawyer in Beijing, and her mother had died she said, the hands of the police who'd beaten her to death, and she had saved her mother's body for years, kept it in cold storage, and it was as evidence, and it was the most heartbreaking sort of story to hear in detail, and that one really stayed with me, and it made its way into the story. And there are a number of other moments or characters in the story too that were sort of seeded from things like that I might encounter in the course of my work or my life in China. I'm thinking of the story Flying Machine, which is, I know there are people who feel strongly about which story is their favorite. Flying Machine is probably mine. It tells the story of an elderly farmer who wants to build his own airplane and fly, even though he's never been on a plane before. And that was one that was absolutely inspired by sort of the morning routine I had in Beijing, which will be familiar to some of the correspondents who are in the room. You sit down and you scan all the local media and see what's going on. And there was one recurring theme that I kept seeing in stories, that of rural inventors who would build everything from like these life-size transformers to airplanes on multiple occasions. And I just remember feeling so struck by that detail and just wanting to know that story. Like, who are these people? What drives them? And really wanting to read that story. And so that was one that came out of a moment like that. And yeah, and also from that story, funeral strippers, which are a real phenomenon in China, which was another one that I encountered and was just like, this is such a vivid, arresting detail. It needs, it's something that just almost seemed to demand being put in a story. Likewise, the noodle chopping robot that Cao Cao invents is very much drawn from real life. I have seen many of those noodle chopping robots, as well as noodle, not noodle, what were they? They were like, they were sort of like stir fry robots, and also robot waiters. And that was one I did do a piece for the journal about. And yeah, just all these details from life in China that sound so surreal and fabulous, but also are just part of the fabric of modern China.
Yeah, I mean, I saw a piece, and I haven't had time to read the whole thing, but you talked with Mimi Wong for Electric Literature, I think, and I love this quote. Mimi talked about a hyper reality. The headline of the piece was, or the title was, "China is too big to fit inside one reality." And I think you said something to the effect of China is a place that demands both genres. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. It is such a place where you do feel like it does mix genres, just day-to-day life there, and living there, the experience can feel so intense, and you do encounter so many things that are surprising and outrageous in cases, and feel very much like they're lifted from sometimes science fiction or fiction. The fact that the government seeds the clouds and decides when it's going to rain. I remember many days in Beijing, like looking out at the sky and thinking, God, please, someone turn on those cloud seeding devices and please turn the skies blue. That was part of kind of the annual ritual ahead of certain political events when they would make it rain to wash away the pollution. Or I'm thinking of a trend that came about when I was in Beijing, in which it was the fashion for a while to wear these like fake green plants on your head. I don't know if anyone else in this room remembers that, but yeah, it was, so there was this one really crowded, popular sort of touristy hutong near where we lived, where sometimes like when you walk down it, it was possible to see, because of so many people there, you know, wearing these like fake plants on their heads, you could almost trick yourself to thinking that you were looking at a moving field. And I love that side of China, just like this element of playfulness and surprise that really attended to like every day that you spent there. There was just, you really never, you had a sense of never knowing what might happen next.
Yeah, I thought, you know, one story that was, you captured some of this feeling, and I'd love to hear you talk about it, so I won't try to do it, was in New Fruit. You talk about a very peculiar fruit. Is it Cheekwol? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you talk about it? I mean, I would try to describe it, but I'm not going to do it justice. So.
Sure. So yes, that story in New Fruit is one that is more laced with magical realism, and it tells a tale of a neighborhood in Beijing, one very much inspired with the one where I lived, a very traditional kind of neighborhood where you have old retirees who sit around and gossip and people watch, and you have all the vegetables and fruit vendors out on the street. And in the story, a new fruit arrives. It is the product of crossbreeding by one man in the countryside, and it starts to flood all of the local markets. And it's a fruit that is extremely potent, and it creates all these feelings in people. The first season, they are these feelings of pleasure and delight that evoke all these sorts of memories for people that are positive. And the next season, something is different in the soil or in the weather. For whatever reason, the fruit exerts different effects, and it makes people start to remember all these things that they want to forget. And some of these are personal kind of tragedies and shames, and others are connected to more national forms of forgetting around the Cultural Revolution. And it starts to shake up people's lives and marriages. It follows the story of one married couple who has fallen out of love. And yeah, it was a story that I loved to write, because it did evoke a very specific part of Beijing that I have a lot of affection for. And I also, yeah, it was something that I was always keenly aware of in China, and in moments like those when you're walking down the street and you know, eavesdropping on conversations around you, and you see these faces of people who have just lived through enormous losses, and looking at them and knowing that history really is not that far removed. And yeah, and so I'm just thinking, you know, what if this fruit came and started to change people's lives? And so much of this collection, many of the stories, including Gubeko Spirit, started as sort of those questions, like seeing situations and wanting to invert them or turn them on their heads in some ways.
Speaking of Gubeko Spirit, so in this story, and we got a good sense of it, the commuters on a Beijing subway line end up stranded for a long time while repairs are being made. It for some reason it reminded me of quite a few things that I've loved over the years, but it just had this incredible sense of you're along for the ride. You know, this story of like you just buy in early on. You're like, I don't know what's happening, but can you know, this is maybe a little more of a craft question or an inspiration question, but there's something about certain stories that really stick with you, and this was one for me that feel like free, or like feel like they're just whatever the rules are. It's like, you know, chuck them out the window and just start writing. What was the writing process like for this?
For that story, it really started as a kind of a thought exercise. I remember taking the subway back, I think from a press conference to the bureau, and having that moment, which maybe other people also have had before, just of thinking, what if we just got stuck? Like, what if things broke down? And looking around at all these fluorescent lit faces and wondering, okay, what would happen next? Like, would we form alliances? Like, how quickly would rules and norms start to break down? And that just grew. And I was thinking, okay, well, what if the subway system is a metaphor in some ways for society? because in Beijing, sometimes it does feel that way. When I first moved to the city in 2006, when I was a student, there were 2 subway lines, and at this point there are like now 22, I think. It's this incredible symbol of modernity for the city, but it's also a place where the government has really worked and sometimes struggled to make it this smooth, orderly place that they want to be. It's a place where often the subway platforms get really crowded, and there's sharp elbows, and sometimes fights or brawls might break out. The government at times has played classical music to try and create a more refined atmosphere, which is one detail that does appear in the book, and has also launched campaigns to try and encourage civilized behavior. At one point, they ran, this was a story that I wrote for the paper, they ran a citywide campaign to try and find the city's top 100 best behaved passengers, sort of like America's Next Top Model, but for public transportation. If I remember correctly, I think like 40,000 people entered. You had to submit a form that laid out your achievements as, or your accomplishments as a rider. Anyway, so yeah, in the story, for people who haven't read it, the subway, this symbol of modernity, has broken down, or one part of it anyway, and the people are stuck. And over time, we see what happens to them. There's state media journalists who come and do profiles about these people and sort of end up making them propaganda subjects. There's romance, there's intrigue. And on the face of it, as I was writing it, on the one hand, it's a story of a broken infrastructure. But to me, it also became, I think, a story about what it means to be human and to live in a society that is broken, and to what extent we accept that, and to what extent we try and change it, to what extent we challenge others or ourselves to try and change the system.
I love that. Everyone should obviously read that story because you're going to read the whole book, but I see we have questions piling up in the Q&A, and I have many more questions, but I don't want to be selfish. So I just want to ask 2 more of mine, and then we can transition over to some of these Q&A questions, and maybe we'll come back to other things. The title story, The Land of Big Numbers. There's another great line. If only he had more money, he could double it, triple it in the market. Everything was going up, up, up around him. In a short time, he too would be on his way. The protagonist in this story gets himself into a tricky situation. Can you set it up for us a little bit and just talk about that?
Yeah, it's a young man, a government bureaucrat, whose pursuit of masculinity and sense of self takes this form of speculating the stock market and bilking his job, and he gets in way over his head very quickly. It's also a story about generational differences and his own relationship with his father, and how he sees his father with, in many ways, a lot of scorn and disappointment. He's like a young guy who prides himself a lot on his taste and his feeling that he has the sense that he's moving forward, and his father, who's this motorcycle driver who has at one point had a grander sense of self, in many ways has abandoned that over the years. And it's about the conflict between the two of them, but it's also a story that's about just this feeling that you're part of a country on the rise, and you too desperately want to join and be part of that, but not quite knowing how to do so.
Yeah, I love the nuances between the generations and how the son sees, things, different possibilities, or has a different self-image, as you were saying. I have to ask also, because you work for the Wall Street Journal, do you own any GameStop stock? Should I buy some, or should I sell the stuff I have?
There is a reason why I do not write about the stock market for the Wall Street Journal. I would be the worst person to try and give any kind of advice. I would be prone to a lot of really impulsive decisions, and like Jufeng in the story, get it way over my head.
Okay, fair enough. And then last question before Q&A. Can I ask you about your great-grandfather? Is there a story to share, or?
Sure, yeah, no, yeah, so I wrote a story about my great-grandfather shortly before I left Beijing, and it was one of my favorite pieces to write because it really was recovering a chapter of lost history for my family. Growing up, I didn't know anything about him, but during that period of time, I found these old family letters and learned that actually he had been a poet and an English language journalist in Beijing, almost exactly 100 years before I moved to the city to do the same thing. And there was this wonderful serendipity about the whole process of digging into records and making trips to the police station to try and figure out more about this man and what had happened to him, eventually finding his grave, which had been desecrated by the communists during the Cultural Revolution. But it was something also that felt really personally significant, just as someone who had spent a lot of time wrestling with China and this idea of what it means to be Chinese. And I mean, part of what this book, I think, really is trying to evoke for readers is the fact that what it means to be Chinese is not any one thing. And when I think about my great-grandfather, who was someone who worked and lived in Japan and New York and Hawaii and was an intellectual who advocated for a democratic vision of China, who believed really earnestly that it could be real, and if history had gone differently, very well might have been. It's something that is poignant to me, and also for me just really makes me think of the importance of individual stories, right? And not letting our vision of China just be defined by the government in some ways, or the party. And in emphasizing and sort of thinking about and celebrating those sorts of stories, just because they really do, I think when we think about the individual, I mean, they really are what contain so much of the future possibilities for China. And so that's part of what I hope this book also evokes for readers and celebrates too.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. Well, great. I see we have a pile of questions, which is exciting. I don't know what order. I guess we'll just start from the top. Anonymous attendee asks a question for both Te-Ping and Charles. How did you write a book while holding a full-time job? Kind of covered this, but anything else you wanted to add to that?
I guess with for me anyway, and of course it would be different for you working as a lawyer. I do think that there's a way that they kind of work in tandem. I mean, with journalism, it's this feeling of compression and discipline, and I sort of think it almost is like being like both a sprinter but also someone who loves to dance, right? And the one kind of makes you crave the other.
That's really well put. I think, yeah, some of the compression and discipline from being a lawyer. I was a lawyer, and then I transitioned to being a TV writer, all while trying to write this book because it took so long. Both of them had a lot of demands, especially in terms of time. So I think doing something on the side weirdly forced me to really care about it. Not that I don't care about it when I have more time, but it's easier to sort of spend that time unwisely when you have more of it. Whereas if you only have a couple hours every day or weekend, you really have to, cherish it. And to that end, I also, got really lucky because I have a really supportive family, like my wife and her dad, like they'd watch the kids, and I'd have to take weekends or evenings, and I'm just, sitting there going, what am I doing? Like, I'm just ignoring my family, trying to slave away at this thing. But yeah, that helps a lot. There's a lot of sacrifices that go into supporting a writer, not just being a writer, especially if you're working full time. Te-Ping, of course, I'm interested in your writing process given our initial interactions. This is from Rhoda Flaxman. How has learning your craft influenced? Maybe I shouldn't read these verbatim because how has learning your craft, not that there's anything wrong with your question, Rhoda. How has learning your craft influenced your identity as a creative writer? And what would you like to write next?
How is learning the craft? Writing process. What can I say? When I was thinking about this event, and I was talking about it with my husband, and I was saying, well, they said probably people ask you about writing process, and so you should be able to be equipped to talk about that. I am not. I haven't really. What he said, I can channel what he said. He said, "Te-Ping, you should put a blanket over your head, and that will give people a good sense of your writing process." That is very literally how I tend to write fiction. It's a habit that I acquired in Chengdu, where I wrote my first novel, because Chengdu is it's a place in China that, because of the way that central heating in China is allocated, it doesn't have any, even though it does get quite cold. And so I would type with my head and whole body and laptop encased in a blanket, because it was so cold. And I found that way, at least my fingers would stay warm enough to type. And it's a habit that stayed with me. I find it very effective. Yeah, I mean, it's how it's shaped my sense of identity. Rhoda, if you want to chime in, if there's anything else more specific I can say. And I feel like there's another part of your question. Oh, about what I'm working on next. I'm working on a novel that's not set in China, and it's very much a work in progress.
That's exciting. I won't poke too hard because I know when people would ask me, how's your novel going? And it was year 6 of not having a novel going. So I want to be sensitive to that. Hearing you talk about writing with a blanket over your head in Chengdu shames me, because if it is anywhere outside of 60 to 75 degrees, I am like literally useless. I have to have very climate controlled conditions. I mean, not that I'm useless as a person, but I am useless as a writer. Like my brain won't function. Actually, 50 to 75, I'm good. So really ill-equipped for life.
You need the right blanket.
Maybe I just need like a full body like slanket or slanket. Anonymous attendee, how do you deal with the question of authenticity when writing AAPI stories? Should cultural authenticity dictate how we portray AAPI voices?
I can weigh in, or Charles, if you want.
No, this is for you for sure.
Yeah, I think some stories are necessarily harder to access, and so I think we, when trying to write them, have a duty to do it as well and as fully as we can. And in my case, I was writing about China in my day-to-day life already as a reporter, and so it was a question that I already was thinking about, and with journalism in an even more, I think, sometimes challenge or loaded way, just knowing, of course, very much that what we were doing was something that had been so effectively walled out by the Chinese government, with the Wall Street Journal's website blocked in China, and other major American newspapers as well. Just a sense of disconnect, right, between what we were doing and the audience. And that's something that I hope is different in fiction. That this is something that can perhaps. We haven't yet found a Chinese publisher, but I would love if it one day does end up being translated. And yeah, as far as authenticity goes, for me, it was really a matter of just trying to steep myself as much as I could in the country, and in having those conversations, and spending the time living there, and doing my best to understand it, but also, of course, knowing that it's an incredibly complex place and I may not do it justice. And that's why we need more stories. We need more stories of all kinds to evoke the place.
No, it's really I love that. Question from Chris Fan, Irvine Represent. I think this is Professor Chris Fan at the University of California. Question, touching on a topic that's come up a few times already, how would you describe your approach to realism in your work? I know that's a big baggy question. And I will warn you as you think about your answer to me. Your answer may go into into an academic work, so be careful. I've met Chris on a couple. I know Chris. We're friends, and I hope this is the right Chris. It's weird if I'm just like saying all this and it's not the right Chris. No, he's written about he's written about a lot of things, I think, but he's written about this topic. So this is coming from from an academic.
How did I approach realism? This is where I feel like my lack of academic background is tripping me out.
Don't get tripped up.
I guess it's really a question of how I approached writing, which was, for me, it was when I was, before I started writing these stories, as I mentioned, I had all these lists of just phrases or details, bits of overheard dialogue that I had assembled over the years. And so it was almost a feeling of like getting to remix and just find places for all of these, like scraps of life that I'd just been wanting so badly to find a place for. And to the extent that I thought about it as realism versus magical, it's also hard to answer, because I feel like in writing the stories, in so many ways, I was writing them just out of this like desperate desire to see this world evoke more fully, and it wasn't something that I had like an ongoing kind of meta narrative in my head over. I'm sorry. That's
I think that's a great answer.
That's not a great answer for if for like an academic text, but that's how it was.
It's was funny to me. I'm probably the only person in the world that's funny to. But what you just experienced was similar to what I did. What I feel like was when I tried to answer some of Chris's questions, Professor Fan's questions, and I felt like the moment where, like, where in Roadrunner and Coyote, and the coyote, like the Roadrunner is so fast he can run across like a gap and gravity doesn't apply to him, but the coyote tries it, and then halfway over the gap he realizes that he's not standing on anything, and then he looks down and then he falls. That's how I felt when I tried to answer an academic. So now I know not to look down that rabbit hole. So what was your experience living in Beijing as a Chinese American? Did that work its way into your stories? Are you writing about China as an outsider or an insider? Sorry, I understand this might be oversimplifying. And how does your knowledge of the Chinese language, assuming you speak fluently, affect your relationship to your writing?
So many questions, good questions. I think as far as my own identity goes and the linguistic side of it and all that, I think made it easier, right? Like I certainly found that as a reporter, I felt like it, in certain situations, it just makes it easier to blend in and kind of become invisible and be a fly on the wall. And also to have people embrace you. I think the broader experience, I feel like that's what I want to be able to see the question again. The experience of being Chinese American in China, it's so funny. Yeah, it was so much curiosity and also misunderstandings. Like people, I remember I would get into pitched arguments with people about whether I was actually American, because in China, of course, the idea of being Chinese is so much attached to ethnic identity. And so people just, for the life of them, often would not believe that I could possibly be American, because they would think, well, you're not Caucasian, like how is this possible? And often, I mean, what I loved in many ways about China broadly, and it certainly came up in the context of being ethnically Chinese, there was just an incredible curiosity. I remember once when I was traveling in Henan, being asked by a taxi driver, once he learned that I was American, he said, if you stay in America long enough, will you start to look like them? And it was a great question. I had never been asked that, but I loved seeing all of that really intense curiosity, right? That it was not particular to me being ethnically Chinese. I mean, I think it's something that anyone spending time in China sees, just like this incredible curiosity about other people, and the world and the pragmatics of it, and how does it work? And so often the questions you get in China are very nuts and bolts, like how do you get a job? What does it mean to vote in America? Like how does your unemployment system work? These really specific granular questions that just speak to this really deep curiosity that I think you do find so often in China, which is something that I hope for readers, that they likewise can become similarly curious and exercise that spirit of curiosity, and which I think is fundamentally so much about what fiction is about, this desire to understand other people and other places better.
There's we could go down all of these paths, and I want to, but I also want to get to people's questions. Warren Wright, did the ancient traditional architecture or shops of China versus the modernization of China with Western shops or images inspire you or create stories for you? I guess we talked about with dualities, but maybe this goes specifically about physical place, right?
Physical place. Yeah, I think just in the juxtaposition, certainly there are stories like Shanghai Murmur, which are situated very much among the gloss and high rises of Shanghai, juxtaposed against other stories in the collection like New Fruit, which are so rooted in a sense of place and old traditional Beijing architecture.
Riley Manning, at what point did you realize this was going to be a book? It sounds like you started writing the stories because you wanted relief from the, quote, serious project you were working on. But when did you know this was a thing of its own?
Yeah, well, when I'd written 10, I gave them to my husband to read. And he's a really lovely human being. He was like, these are good. And so that was encouraging. And
good answer.
But also he's my husband and just a really nice person who was going to like anything that I wrote. So at that point, then I did start reaching out to agents, and one of them really kindly also saw something in the collection. And I guess it was at that point that I realized it could be something. Yeah, and then Lulu was published in the New Yorker, and then that was really exciting, and then publishers were interested.
Oh yeah, I bet. I had a whole bunch of questions I wanted to ask you about that, but we still have a couple more questions here. Do you think your relationship with this is from E. Madison Shimoda. Do you think your relationship with the English language changed while you were living in China? What's the relationship between your first and second languages?
No, I don't think so. I mean, sometimes I felt like I became less articulate in English, but that's probably just me blaming the fact that I was spending so much time speaking. No, I mean, not really. I don't think my relationship with the English language changed particularly.
And Edward Wong asks, what works, writing or otherwise, have influenced or inspired your art? Separately or related, what are your favorite fictitious portrayals of China, again, in writing or any other medium?
Oh, great question. So writers that influence the work. I love writers like Carmen Maria Machado, Leslie Arima, George Saunders, Charles Yu, people who just have this incredibly expressive imagination and sense of play in their works, which is something I very much tried to channel in this book. And also love writers like Kazuo Shigeru and Junko Lahiri and Meili Malloy, people who have this incredible eye for like crystalline detail and ability to write this beautifully transparent prose. And that was also something else I think that influenced certain stories in the book, or those were some of the authors that I was reading while writing. And as far as favorite representations in literature, I love Yu Hua's The Seventh Day. That's one that I often recommend to people. I also really love Liao Yiwu's Corpse Walker, which is a really good example, I think, of someone writing about real life in China, these incredibly closely observed portraits of society from the bottom up, but told in this way that is so human and intimate and granular that it has this novelistic sense to it. He's another writer who I love.
That's great. I'll have to check all that out. Well, this is perfect. I mean, I did have one more question I had to ask, which is, although maybe more questions are creeping in. You did not get an MFA, is that right?
I did not, no.
You did not. That was my question, that's it. I thought I had more to that, I really didn't. Sometimes your mouth just goes before your brain does. Well, I think we're rounding off. There's Lily to save me.
Thank you both so much. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions. There were so many good ones. I want to thank everyone in the audience for engaging in the chat, submitting questions. And of course, thank you to Te-Ping and Charles as well for this beautiful book, these incredible stories, and this incredibly vibrant conversation. I just have a couple of very quick closing notes before we end for the night. Just a couple of upcoming events at AAWW. This Thursday, we are working with Riverhead Books to launch Chiang-Mai Lee's new novel. He'll be in conversation with Brian Washington. On Saturday, we're celebrating Nikesh Shukla's new memoir. He will be in conversation with Amira Jacob, and you can RSVP for those at aaww.org/events. I want to thank our friends at Books Are Magic once again, who are providing book sales. You can find a link in the chat to purchase Te-Ping and Charles's books, and we really hope that you do so. You will also find the noodle recipe from Tables of Contents in the chat, and it's delicious. It looks amazing. I am very excited to cook it, and I hope that you all will do the same and tag us in photos when you make it. And then finally, I want to note that this event was recorded. It will be available shortly on our YouTube channel and our podcast, AAWW Radio. So if you want to share, if you want to return to what was discussed, you'll be able to. And thank you all again. I'm going to call for sort of a round of applause, a round of virtual applause in the chat on Zoom. Thank you both so much for being here. We're going to actually keep the Zoom open for a couple of minutes so that people can kind of sign off, ask any final questions in the chat. And then we hope we'll see you at future AAWW events. Thank you both so much.